At Fort Braddock, Maggie Cole, a seasoned veteran in her 50s, endures daily mockery and isolation from younger soldiers. They spread vicious rumors, believing she abandoned her unit and froze during a mission, a narrative fueled by unexplained gaps in her service record and her distinct limp. Maggie silently performs her demanding supply duty, finding refuge in the endless storage rooms. Unbeknownst to her tormentors, her quiet dignity hides a profound secret. She was once Shade, an elite operative from a Black Ops team, forced to take the fall for a highly classified 1985 mission to protect national secrets. Her only visible clue to this past is a mysterious tattoo on her arm. When General Redmond unexpectedly spots this unique symbol during an inspection, Maggie's long-buried truth begins to surface, threatening to shatter everything the base thought they knew. If Maggie's inspiring journey resonated with you, please support our channel by liking this video and subscribing for more stories of quiet courage. Your engagement helps us bring these vital narratives to light. Join our community in honoring the unseen, unheard, and unrecognized heroes among us. Maggie Cole had heard it. She always did. This time, though, the words hung heavier in the air than usual. I wouldn't trust her to guard a broom closet, let alone wear that uniform, one young soldier sneered loud enough for others to hear, sparking a ripple of laughter. Maggie didn't respond. She never did. Head bowed, she kept pushing the crate, its weight digging into her shoulders, her hands gripped white-knuckled around the handle. The summer heat pressed down like punishment, forcing her at last to roll up one sleeve. That's when they saw it. Black ink, etched with purpose and precision, an unfamiliar symbol revealed beneath her skin. It was clean and deliberate, part eagle's wing, part triangle, sharp edges giving way to secrets. General Thomas Redmond had arrived unannounced, his presence barely registering, until he saw it. Mid-step, he froze. A silence dropped over the yard, unnatural and immediate, as if the air itself had been yanked still. "Where?" he asked, voice low, not much more than a whisper, but the words cut through the courtyard like shrapnel. "Where did you get that symbol?" The atmosphere changed. A current of something electric and cold swept through the base. Because when a general speaks like that, in that tone, people know. A boundary has been crossed. Something hidden is about to be dragged into the light. The Oklahoma sun blazed above them, merciless and unrelenting. Each morning it rose like an adversary, baking the brittle dust that clung to the aging bones of Fort Braddock's barracks. And each morning, without fail, Maggie Cole showed up for what they still called duty, though no one else used that word anymore. They called it supply work, busy work, or when their cruelty ran unchecked, penance. She walked with a limp, left leg dragging just enough to mark her stride. The ankle never bent right anymore. Each step carried weight, not just from the injury, but from something deeper. Her movements were careful, practiced, not slow because she was weak, but slow because they had to be. Her limp made her an easy target, easy for muttered comments, side eyes, and mockery. The injury didn't come from age, though she carried her 50-something years with the quiet composure of someone who didn't need to prove anything. The limp belonged to a history no one asked about, because they all believed they already knew. Rumors had clung to her like dust from the moment she stepped foot on base, whispered and repeated, reshaped and sharpened by each retelling. They circled through the mess hall, drifted along the gym's echoing walls, seeped into shooting range chatter. That's her, the one who abandoned her unit, left them to die, and slithered into some cushy storage job to hide until retirement. I heard she froze on a mission. Command only keeps her around out of pity. No one remembered who said it first. Maybe it started with a young corporal skimming her file and noticing the redacted pages, the unexplained relocations, the absence of medals where there should have been many. Maybe it was a bored private who filled in the blanks with stories that fit his imagination. But once the lie had shape, it ran. And once it ran, it couldn't be caught. Maggie's life became a ritual of shadows, moving through dimly lit storage rooms lined with crates and long-forgotten equipment. She touched everything with the kind of careful, exacting attention that only came from someone who cared more than she let on. Her hands, calloused and scarred, moved confidently across clipboards and computer terminals, double-checking inventory logs, repairing what was salvageable, discarding what was not. None of the younger soldiers saw this. Not really. To them, she was part of the background, a relic, a punchline. During breaks, phones came out. Grainy TikTok videos were shared, clips of Maggie pushing heavy crates, dragging pallets across scuffed concrete. Base ghost, one caption read. Moves slower than my grandma, read another, layered over a sped-up video of her bending to retrieve fallen tools. Sometimes they wanted more than just the footage. A private might roll a water bottle her way just to watch it bump her boots. Another would deliberately leave a locker door ajar so it would slam as she passed, startling her just enough to satisfy their cruelty. These petty torments unfolded daily, mostly unnoticed, rarely questioned. Certainly never stopped. Still, she said nothing. She lifted crates that would have strained much younger bodies. She loaded and unloaded trucks. She reorganized entire bays of neglected supplies without help. The limp slowed her, yes, but it never stopped her. That limp, though, oh, it was a favorite target. Every shift of her footing, every wince as she rubbed her knee, was ammunition for whispers. Bet that leg locked all you on her the day she left her squad, someone sneered once. She heard, she always did, but Maggie Cole kept her head down. She kept working, kept enduring, and it wasn't just the physical toll, the weight of crates or machinery. What pressed hardest on her shoulders was the silence, the solitude. She sat alone every day in the far, moving, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed herself. Her shoulder throbbed with every motion, the wet heat of blood soaking into her uniform. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Failure wasn't an option. Not for the boy, not for the family waiting on her, not for the team she'd already lost too much of. They hid in a collapsed drainage tunnel until the worst of the search parties passed, then crawled their way out through the mud and rot, rejoining the jungle at dawn. Every sound became a threat, every bird call or snapping twig another warning. Maggie kept the boy close, her body between him and danger. For 2 days, they moved like shadows through the wilderness, living off ration bars and river water, dodging patrols, using coded markers to navigate toward the exfil point. When they finally reached the extraction zone, it was deserted. No helicopter, no signal. Just empty sky and the rising panic of being abandoned. But Maggie waited. She built a crude blind from brush and debris and hunkered down with the boy, keeping him calm, teaching him how to listen, how to be still. On the third night, the roar of rotors finally pierced the silence. A black silhouette hovered above the trees, low and fast. Maggie lit the signal flare with shaking hands. The dust-off was brief and brutal, shots fired from the tree line, bullets slicing the air as they scrambled aboard. The boy screamed as Maggie threw her body over his. A sharp pain lanced through her leg. Another hit. But the bird lifted, leaving the chaos below in a storm of wind and noise. She didn't remember passing out, only waking up in a sterile white room somewhere that smelled of antiseptic and secrecy. A man in a suit, face blank and voice cold, had been waiting for her. Officially, he said, none of this happened. You were never there. Your team never existed. And that boy, just a ghost. We appreciate your service, Agent Shade, but your chapter ends here. And that was it. No medals, no commendations, no flag-draped ceremonies for the fallen. Just a new identity, a transfer order, and silence. She became Maggie Cole, logistics officer, paper pusher, ghost of a war no one talked about. And over time, the whispers began, muted suspicions, sideways glances, the kind of quiet cruelty that thrives in closed ranks. No one knew what she'd done. They only saw the limp, the vacant eyes, the woman who kept to herself and never smiled. Rumors filled in the blanks. She was a screw-up, a washout, dead weight that never pulled her share. And Maggie let them think that. Because the truth, what really happened, wasn't something that could be explained over beers or smoothed out in a PowerPoint presentation. It was etched into scars and sealed documents, too heavy for words, too dangerous for daylight. So she carried it alone. At that corner table, sunlight catching the dust like snow in a quiet storm, Maggie Cole sat apart, not because she wanted to, but because the weight of her truth had carved distance between her and everyone else. And yet, despite everything, she endured. The jokes, the stares, the silence. Because sometimes surviving isn't loud or proud. Sometimes it's quiet and steady, like breath through pain, like a hand on a boy's back in the middle of gunfire. And Maggie knew, had always known, that real strength isn't always seen. Sometimes it hides in shadows. Sometimes it limps through the yard uninvited. And sometimes it wears the name Maggie Cole and says nothing at all. She moved like she was made of steel and memory, slow, deliberate, determined. 13 years had passed, and still that night lived inside her. It was the night she carried him, 12 long miles through wet jungle and sucking mud, her own blood mixing with the earth. A bullet lodged in her side that she hadn't even realized was there until hours later. He was barely conscious, slipping in and out, but she never let him fall. Through enemy patrols, through the silence of death and the noise of her heartbeat pounding in her ears, she kept going. She moved because stopping meant both of them would die. When they finally staggered across into safe territory, the jungle gave way to dawn, pale light brushing the treetops. Her knees gave out. She collapsed into the dry dust, too worn out to speak, too cripey to explain. Before she even had the strength to clean the blood from her hands, his and hers alike, the official story had already been drafted, filed, and sealed. The mission, according to the report, had never existed. The extraction target was listed as MIA. Her team? Killed during a training exercise gone wrong. There were no citations, no heroes, no official acknowledgement. Maggie was quietly reassigned to a non-combat logistics post back in the States. Without ceremony, a sealed file appeared in her record. She was never allowed to read it, but the consequences were immediate. It blamed her for operational errors that supposedly led to friendly casualties. It was just a line meant to cover the real reason for her transfer, a lie designed to bury the truth without giving away the mission. But the lie didn't stay buried. It took on a life of its own. Command moved forward, but the rumors didn't. Soldiers talk, and slowly what had once been fiction crafted for secrecy became gospel. Whispers twisted into accusations. She was no longer the soldier who dragged a bleeding man 12 miles to safety. She was now the woman who panicked under fire, the one who ran, the one who got her team killed. And the cruelest part, she was not allowed to say a word in her defense. Her silence wasn't just expected, it was enforced. At first, Maggie believed the truth would surface, that someone somewhere in the chain of command would remember, that justice, however slow, would eventually arrive. But years passed. The people who had known what really happened either moved on, retired, or died. The files remained buried, sealed behind layers of clearance. And the truth? It became just another ghost. Meanwhile, the legend of Maggie the coward hardened like rusted steel. It clung to her like a second skin. At Fort Braddock, she stayed invisible, sorting supplies, cleaning the weapons others left behind, doing the jobs nobody else wanted. She said nothing. She gave them no ammunition. But when the room was empty, her thoughts drifted back to that jungle, to the boy whose life she had carried on her back. His face stayed with her, a flicker in her memory, and she often wondered if he ever remembered her at all. Did he know? Did he understand what it had cost her? Her name, her career, her honor, all of it given up without a fight. Not because she was weak, but because she had made a promise. The tattoo on her forearm was the only visible trace of what she'd survived, an eagle's wing enclosed in a sharply angled triangle. Stark black against her skin, it had been meant as a quiet tribute to the team that never made it home, to the mission that could never be spoken of, to the truth she'd sworn to protect even if it destroyed her. She kept it covered. Most days anyway. But even armor can crack beneath the relentless sun of Oklahoma. And sometimes when the light hit just right, that mark would show. And that's when the secret began to surface. Because no truth stays buried forever. General Thomas Redmond wasn't supposed to be at Fort Braddock that day. His official inspection wasn't due for another 6 months. But Redmond had learned over 40 years in the service that the truth of a base wasn't found in scheduled visits or polished tours. It was found in surprise, in disruption, in catching everyone off guard. So he came unannounced. His convoy kicked up a cloud of dust as it rumbled onto the base. Chaos followed. Officers barked orders. Soldiers scrambled to fall in. Uniforms were straightened in haste. Gear shined in record time. But Redmond wasn't interested in ceremony. He had seen it all. He had bled in too many countries and buried too many friends to be impressed by pretense. He never followed the planned route. He didn't want the clean motor pools or the curated offices. He wandered, and I always had, because where they least expected him, that's where the truth liked to hide. That's how he found himself near the warehouses, the overlooked corner of Fort Braddock where no one bothered to clean up for guests. And that's where he saw her, Maggie Cole, working alone, like always. She didn't notice him at first. She was too focused on shifting a heavy crate of field radios, her muscles tight with effort. The sunlight streamed in through cracked windows, turning dust into golden haze. Her uniform was darkened with sweat at the collar and beneath the arms. She strained and her sleeve rode up, and in that moment, the light caught the tattoo on her forearm. It was just a flash, ink against sun, but for Redmond, it was enough. That symbol, the wing and triangle. He froze, a flicker of recognition in his eyes because he knew what it meant. He remembered. The tattoo seemed to burn against her weathered skin. Redmond froze. The sweltering heat, the grit in the air, the constant hum and clatter of the bass, all of it receded into a distant haze. In that suspended moment, the general's mind surged forward, dragging long-buried memories from the shadows of classified operations and forgotten wars. He knew that emblem, not from a uniform or a service manual, not from any record the Pentagon kept. That symbol belonged to something far deeper. Operations so covert they were never briefed in war rooms, only murmured about in shielded bunkers behind layers of security clearance. It was the mark of a team that went where no satellite could track, where no support would ever come. A team whose missions left no paper trail, only scars, on flesh, on conscience, on history. They didn't just serve the country. They protected it from the unimaginable. Threats so dangerous they couldn't be spoken aloud. And those missions? They were erased before they even began. Redmond's voice broke the silence like a blade slicing clean through tension. "Sergeant." The word came low, edged in steel, and Maggie responded before her mind could catch up. Her spine snapped straight, instincts honed from years of service and survival pulling her into posture. Her body obeying a command her heart hadn't processed yet. She turned, breath stilled in her lungs, but Redmond wasn't watching her face. His gaze remained fixed on that symbol, dark against her skin. He took one deliberate step forward. The sound of his boots against the concrete echoed faintly. For a moment, just a moment, his voice faltered, something rare and unsettling from a man known for being unshakable. When he spoke again, it was a whisper, barely audible but powerful enough to carry through the cavernous warehouse. "Where did you get that symbol?" Maggie didn't answer. Couldn't. Her silence wasn't hesitation, it was discipline, hardwired into her through relentless training and unspeakable sacrifice. That mark wasn't meant for questions. It wasn't meant to be seen at all. It was a vow, a history soaked in blood, loss, and unswerving loyalty. Telling the truth wouldn't just be disobedience. It would be betrayal. Betrayal of the mission, of those who didn't make it back, of the oath etched into her soul. But Redmond saw something in her silence, in the way she stood, in the weight she carried. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't fear, it was recognition. Because he had worn that same silence once, carried that same burden. Footsteps echoed from behind him. Lieutenant Blake hurried in, clutching a notepad, ready to record whatever standard inspection notes the general might dictate. But as he stepped into the warehouse, the atmosphere hit him like a wall, dense, humming with unspoken tension. He hesitated. "Sir?" Blake asked, uncertain. Redmond didn't turn. "Lieutenant, I want this soldier's file, not the one in her personnel folder. I want the Black Archive, now." Blake's breath caught. The Black Archive. That wasn't just high clearance. It was the kind of archive that most officers weren't even told existed. It was reserved for operations buried beneath the deepest layers of secrecy. But he didn't ask questions. He saluted and ran, the thudding of his boots fading into the distance. Maggie stood in the stillness, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel it, eyes watching from just beyond the warehouse doors. Word had already begun to spread. Soldiers shifted, whispering, pulled toward the building by something unseen but undeniable. Why was the general speaking to her? What was going on? Redmond didn't flinch beneath the pressure of their curiosity. His eyes remained locked on Maggie, though the storm inside him intensified. Fragments of reports from decades past collided in his memory. Reports marked eyes only, missions buried so deep even most generals never knew of them. He remembered now, the whispers of a jungle op in the mid-80s, an extraction that never officially happened, a unit that vanished into the darkness. All presumed lost, except one, the survivor, the one who emerged when all hope was gone. Minutes later, Blake returned, panting, a thin black folder clutched in his hand. Without a word, Redmond took it and flipped it open right there in the heat and dust. His eyes scanned the contents, jaw tightening, expression darkening with every classified line. It was all there. The mission, the ambush, the miracle extraction, the deliberate fabrication that rewrote Maggie's legacy, casting her into shadow to protect a truth too dangerous to surface. They destroyed her career, her reputation, to preserve national secrets. Redmond closed the file slowly, reverently, as if it were a headstone. "We failed you," he said, voice rough, scraping against guilt. "My God, we failed you." Outside, the murmurs had become a ripple, swelling into a wave. The soldiers who had laughed, who had gossiped and mocked the quiet, scarred woman in the corner. Suddenly, they began to understand. She wasn't the disgrace. They were. And for the first time in countless years, Maggie allowed herself to exhale. Not just breath, but a weight lifted, if only slightly. Maybe, just maybe, the truth had finally begun to claw its way out of the shadows. At Fort Braddock, word spread like wildfire, uncontrollable, unstoppable. One spark had ignited something no one could smother. All across the base, soldiers abandoned their duties, drawn like moths to flame, heading for the warehouse where something extraordinary was unfolding. They gathered in knots, uncertainty on their faces, trading fragmented whispers and wary glances. Inside, history was being rewritten, not in ink, but in truth. He stepped out into the open yard, the black folder still clutched in his hands. The Oklahoma sun hung low in the sky now, painting everything in a fading golden glow that made the entire base look almost dreamlike. Worn, weathered, and weighed down by memory. Faces that had once looked sharp and proud now seemed older, more tired, as if the light itself had called up every mistake they'd tried to forget. "Form up," the general commanded, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order, unmistakable and absolute. Officers and enlisted soldiers alike scrambled into formation, boots thudding against the hard ground. Confusion swept through the lines like a gust of wind. This wasn't regulation. This wasn't how end-of-day inspections were done. Near the warehouse doors, Maggie Cole stood motionless, uncertain. Her body leaned toward retreat, instincts urging her to disappear into the shadows once again. But something deeper, something long dormant inside her name, held her in place. It was quiet but solid, a piece of herself she thought she'd buried years ago. Redmond's eyes swept slowly across the assembled ranks. Young soldiers with barely healed scars, seasoned veterans who'd seen too much, officers who should have known better. His face was unreadable, carved from something harder than stone. "Every single one of you," he began, his tone even, steady, "owes this soldier an apology." A stunned silence fell over the yard. Not a word, not a breath. "This is Sergeant Margaret Cole," he went on, lifting the black folder slightly. "Some of you called her a washout, a coward, a disgrace. You whispered about how she failed her unit, how she ran from her duty. But you were wrong." His voice sharpened, his words cutting like glass. "You were completely, unforgivably wrong." Maggie felt the shift immediately. Every head turned toward her. But this time, the gazes weren't mocking. They were uncertain, ashamed. Their judgment had turned into something quieter, heavier. Redmond opened the folder, his finger steady, and began to read. Slowly, deliberately. In 1980, Sergeant Cole took part in an operation so classified it's not even listed in your records. She completed that mission, knowing that it meant the end of her career, her reputation, even her name. She made that sacrifice to protect this country and to protect people none of you will ever know. He paused just long enough for the words to sink in. The story you've all been passing around about her failure, about her cowardice, it was a fabrication, a lie designed to protect national security. And you believed it, because that was easier than questioning it. Shifting echoed softly in the stillness. Uniforms rustled. Boots moved uneasily. No one dared interrupt. "Lieutenant Blake," Redmond called out, fixing his gaze on one figure. A young officer stepped forward, face pale, guilt written in every line of his posture. "Sir," he answered, voice low. "Report." Blake swallowed visibly. "Sir, I witnessed the harassment. I didn't stop it. I let it happen because I didn't think it was my place. I failed, sir." Redmond's nod came slowly. "You did, but you admitted it. Now learn from it." He turned his focus back to the gathered formation. "Every one of you needs to take a hard look in the mirror, because what happened here, what you allowed to happen, is not what this uniform stands for. This woman," he gestured toward Maggie, "carried the burden of a secret so dangerous, so vital, that we buried the truth to keep it hidden. And in doing that, we buried her too." His next words were lower, meant only for her as he took a quiet step forward. "We're going to make this right. It won't bring back the years, but we can begin." Maggie parted her lips slightly as if to respond, but no sound came. Instead, she gave him a simple nod, small but firm. Contained in that one gesture was the strength of someone who had weathered storms in silence for far too long. Redmond turned back to the troops. "There will be a formal ceremony," he announced. "Her record will be amended, her honors will be reinstated. And those among you who laughed at her, mocked her, spread lies, you will stand and bear witness to her restoration." He let the silence stretch before continuing. "And I will personally see to it that every officer on this base completes additional training in leadership and integrity." His hand rose again, pointing toward Maggie. "Because this," he said, "should have been seen for what it was, not failure, but heroism." As the sun finally dipped beneath the horizon, casting the last of its glow over the dusty base, the soldiers began to disperse. No one spoke above a whisper. Conversations that once brimmed with arrogance, with gossip, with noise, were now filled with silence and reflection. The air was heavier now, not with judgment, but with truth. Later, a few came to her, hesitant, awkward. They offered quiet apologies, nods of respect, unsure of what words could ever be enough. Most said nothing, and that was fine. She wasn't asking for words. 3 weeks passed in silence before the formal recognition finally came. Not in some gilded hall or stately auditorium, but in the same dim concrete warehouse where the truth about Maggie had first begun to claw its way into the light. The general had insisted on it. He thought it fitting, no fanfare, no press, no polished speeches. Just soldiers standing at attention, faces solemn, bearing witness to what should have been acknowledged long ago. General Redmond stood tall and still, his voice unwavering as he read the long, suppressed citations. The Defense Superior Service Medal, the Bronze Star adorned with a valor device, a citation for extraordinary heroism under overwhelming circumstances. Words that had been buried now rose in the silence, echoing off the cold walls like ghosts being named and set free. He pinned each decoration to Maggie's uniform with care, and when he had finished, he looked her in the eyes and said only 4 words, simple, unadorned but heavy with truth. "We failed you. No more." Maggie didn't smile. No tears welled in her eyes. She didn't tremble or nod. But if you watched closely, really watched, you would have seen the faint shift in her shoulders, the release of tension forged over years of silence and dismissal. It wasn't a transformation. Not yet. But it was a beginning, a letting go. And when the ceremony concluded, when the last salute dropped and the room returned to stillness, Maggie didn't linger. She turned, not to retreat, but to return. To her post, to her work, to the life that had been waiting on the other side of recognition. At long last, the truth had found its voice. But the story didn't end with the last pin or the final salute. If anything, that moment was only the first crack in a dam long overdue to break. Fort Braddock didn't just slide back into the rhythm of drills and duty rosters. Not right away. The atmosphere had changed, subtly but unmistakably. You don't see a lie that vast unravel and just move on like nothing happened. In the days that followed, something shifted. The usual chatter, the offhand jokes, the dismissive comments, the sidelong glances disappeared. Conversations quieted, not from fear, but from respect. Reverence, even. Maggie's vindication wasn't what had stunned them most. It was the sobering realization of their own complicity, the things they had allowed, the truths they had ignored, the silence they had helped maintain. General Redmond stayed longer than he'd intended. He personally oversaw the earliest rounds of what he called integrity retraining. But these weren't just dry lectures or obligatory briefings. These were raw, honest conversations, face-to-face reckonings about leadership, accountability, and the sacred responsibility each soldier holds to uphold the dignity of their brothers and sisters in arms. He stood before the rooms packed with the officers and enlisted personnel alike, not as a distant authority figure, but as someone who had come to deliver hard, necessary truths. This failure wasn't Maggie Cole's, he told them. It was ours. Mine, yours, the system's. And the only way to honor what she carried for so long is to make damn sure no one else has to carry it again. He didn't dress it up with euphemisms. He talked about courage, not the kind that charges into battle, but the kind that endures shame in silence for the sake of others. The kind that refuses to betray a mission, even when that mission betrays you. The kind that doesn't come with ceremonies or ribbons, and often doesn't get recognized at all. He spoke about the danger of going along to get along, about how casual rumors, left unchecked, can cut deeper than any wound in combat. And slowly, quietly, the base listened. Lieutenant Blake, who once had chosen to look away, felt the full weight of his silence in the days after the warehouse ceremony. That guilt had sat like lead in his gut. But Redmond didn't abandon him to it. With the general's guidance, Blake began to change. He started speaking up when things didn't sit right. He used his rank not to shield himself, but to protect those beneath him. In meetings, in mess halls, even in the field, he stepped in. Small moments, but meaningful. He became a quiet example, and younger soldiers took notice. Maggie, meanwhile, went back to the job she had never stopped doing. But everything was different. The once forgotten storage rooms no longer felt like exile. Soldiers began stopping by, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. They asked her opinion on logistical questions. They invited her to grab coffee, to sit with them at lunch. She didn't say yes right away. She'd been burned too deeply for that. But little by little, she began to accept. And with each invitation accepted, the invisibility she had worn like armor began to fall away. Outside the base, the story couldn't be contained. Not forever. Despite official efforts to keep it quiet, the truth, as it tends to do, found its way out. Veterans groups caught wind and began sharing Maggie's story through newsletters and online posts. Military families, mothers, fathers, children, read it and demanded explanations. They wanted to know how this could have happened, why it had taken so long to right a wrong. The noise reached Washington. Within months, Capitol Hill was buzzing. Hearings were scheduled. Testimony was gathered, not from Maggie, who declined to speak, choosing instead to let her actions and sacrifices speak louder than words, but from General Redmond, from Lieutenant Blake, and from others who had seen what happened and who could no longer stay silent. The result was a new piece of legislation, the Quiet Valor Act, a rare bipartisan effort born not of politics, but of shame and resolve. It was designed to re-examine the service records of soldiers who had operated in the shadows, those whose missions had been cloaked in secrecy, whose contributions had gone unrecognized. A special commission was formed to investigate cases like Maggie's, to find them, to see them, and finally to honor them. Secrecy had long buried true heroism beneath layers of manufactured disgrace. For years, the truth had been silenced, tucked away behind security clearances and classified documents, leaving those who had served honorably to live under a fog of fabricated shame. But then, slowly and across the nation, the silence began to lift. Stories surfaced, hundreds of them. Stories of brave men and women who had endured decades of undeserved disgrace. Soldiers whose acts of courage had been hidden behind the veil of national security, their sacrifices rewritten or erased entirely. Then the tide began to shift. Medals, long withheld, were finally awarded. Service records were corrected to reflect the truth. Families who had once been told misleading or vague accounts of their loved ones' roles now learned the full extent of what they had done, the real costs they had borne. Some veterans returned to the public eye to share their stories, to reclaim their legacies. But not Maggie. Maggie had no interest in the spotlight. She didn't want the attention, the speeches, or the staged applause. But Redmond persuaded her, gently, respectfully, to lend her name without fanfare to something quietly powerful. A new center was established near the base, not with ribbon cuttings or media coverage, but with purpose. It would bear her name, the Maggie Cole Quiet Valor Center. It wasn't built for headlines. It didn't seek publicity or fundraising campaigns. What it offered instead was real impact, a sanctuary for veterans who had served on classified missions, those who had done what could never be openly acknowledged. At the center, they could find support, counseling, and community. They didn't need to reveal what they weren't allowed to speak of. No explanations were required. The weight of their silence was already understood. The staff themselves were part of that same hidden world. Former operatives, intelligence officers, military chaplains, people who knew the cost of silence and carried similar invisible scars. They offered a place not of interrogation, but of belonging. A rare space where no one had to justify what they had endured. Maggie spent many evenings there, drawn not by obligation but by connection. She would sit quietly with other veterans around the modest fire pit behind the building. There was coffee, quiet conversation, and sometimes no words at all. Long silences stretched between them, filled not with awkwardness, but with shared understanding. No one asked for specifics. No one needed to. Their bond lived in the unspoken truths they all carried, the price paid in secrecy for a nation's security. One cool autumn night, under a sky scattered with stars and the warm crackle of the fire beside her, a young veteran approached. He was probably no older than 30, but the lines etched across his face told a different story, one shaped more by what he'd been through than how many years he'd lived. "I heard what they did to you," he said softly, his voice steady but roughened by something deeper. "What you went through, it helped. Just knowing someone else survived it." Maggie looked at him for a moment, studying his eyes, reading everything he wasn't saying. Then she gave a single, quiet nod. "That's why we're here," she answered simply. That was all, and it was enough. General Redmond retired soon after the reforms began to take hold. At his farewell address, he spoke of Maggie without ever saying her name. "We failed a hero," he admitted to the room, his voice heavy with sincerity. "But by facing that failure, we found the way forward. Let that be what we leave behind. Not the mistake, but the learning, the change, and the honor we restored to those who couldn't speak for themselves." Fort Braddock changed too. Over time, its legacy transformed. It stopped being remembered for the scandal and instead became known for the example it set in the aftermath. It became a place where soldiers were taught to look out for each other, where snap judgments were questioned, and where quiet courage was recognized, even when there were no medals to pin. And Maggie finally found peace, not through ceremonies or the spotlight, but in the small, steady work of restoring dignity, in helping to lighten the loads others had carried for far too long, in showing that healing could come in the form of quiet evenings, shared silence, and human connection that asked for nothing in return. Now, as the story of Maggie Cole fades from news cycles and public hearings, its lessons remain. Lessons that still matter, maybe now more than ever. In a world that moves faster each day, where people are quick to judge, where rumors outrun the truth and assumptions too often stand in for facts, Maggie's experience warns us of the danger in that. She endured years of exile, humiliation, and injustice. Not because she failed, but because no one thought to stop and ask the harder questions. How often do we still do that? In our towns, our offices, even within our own families? How often do we let suspicion, bias, or gossip decide who someone is instead of taking the time to really see them? Her story reminds us of what it means to hold the line, not just in battle, but within oneself. To stay true, to preserve one's dignity in the face of doubt, to carry on with quiet strength when everything else falls away. And it calls on the rest of us, especially those who have lived long enough to know how fleeting public opinion can be, to become better stewards of each other's humanity, to guard not just against injustice, but against the casual, quiet cruelty of indifference. Perhaps you've known someone like Maggie Cole. Perhaps you've been that person, misunderstood, misjudged, burdened by truths you couldn't share. If so, her story is also yours. And perhaps, like Maggie, you've seen what happens when people choose the easy narrative over the difficult truth. If that resonates with you, maybe now's the time to ask, how do we stop it? How do we change that pattern? Not just in theory, but in the ways we live, speak, and act. Because real change starts there, in conversation, in community, in courage. Not all heroes wear medals. Not all battles are fought with weapons. And not all victories are celebrated with parades. Some of the most meaningful triumphs happen in silence, through steadfast dignity, quiet resilience, and the strength to carry on when no one's watching. Let's remember that. Let's honor that. And let's try to become a people who value quiet courage just as much as the loud.